What's up, people? This is Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com, and in this video, we are going to master the fourth logic game from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. So if you haven't already, follow the link in the description below to take this test on your own, and then we'll master all the questions you had trouble with together. And you can use the timestamps below to jump to specific questions. Let's look at game number 4 from the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. We have an 8-day festival, and 6 plays will be performed. So it looks like that is our list of 6 variables. As always, we start off by writing them out for reference. GHJ, Lute, Macbeth, and Othello. And it says it's an 8-day festival, and there will be 1 performance each of the 8 days, which means this is a sequencing game, except the numbers don't line up. There are 8 spots, but there are only 6 letters to use to fill up all 8 of those spots, which obviously means that some of these letters will have to be repeated more than once in order to fill up the spots. And if we go ahead and look at the first 2 rules, they spell that out for us pretty clearly. The play performed on 1 must also be performed on day 5. So these 2 spots are the same. We're going to show this on the grid. We always want to be as visual as possible. So when we have rules that deal with specific spots, we show it on those spots. So we'll just put a giant equal sign between those 2 boxes. And then day 2 must be the same as day 7. So whatever's there must be the same as whatever's there. Again, I'll just draw a big equal sign. This time I'll do it underneath. And I think that makes it super clear. And therefore, that will fill up all the 8 spots, right? We have 6 letters, which means 6 letters, if there were 1 of each, would have filled up 6 spots. So in order to get up to 8, we have to double 2 of them, right? 2 of these 6 letters have to be doubled. And with those 2 extras, that will total 8. And now we can see where those doubled letters are going to go. One of the letters that's doubled is going to be in 1 and 5. The other of the 6 letters that is doubled is going to be in 2 and 7. And then all the other letters will just be singles, right? So anything that's not in 1 or 5 or 2 or 7 will just be a single letter, right? It's good to notice these numerical realities when you have logic games like this where the numbers don't add up, right? We have 6 letters and 8 spots. That means that to make up the 8 spots, 2 of those 6 letters will have to be doubled, and now we can see exactly where those doubled letters are going to go on the grid, which means that whatever's in 3, 4, 6, and 8 will have to just be single letters. That will have to be the one place that that letter goes. So let's look at the remaining 3 rules. Macbeth and Othello can't be consecutive. We know exactly how to write that. This is how we show consecutive letters, right? M can't go right before O or right after O. Next, for at least 1 performance of H, the next thing must be M. So that means for at least 1 H, so at least 1 time, there has to be an H right before an M, 1 plus, meaning 1 or more. 1 or more times, there must be H right before M. And then finally, there must be a J sometime before there's any H. So there must be a J sometime before the first H. Let's just be as clear as possible. Wherever that first H is, there has to be a J somewhere before it, right? That's what it means when it says there must be a J sometime before there's any H. Wherever the first H is, there has to be a J somewhere before it. So this is our setup. I think everything is nice and clear. Let's go ahead and look at the questions. 18 is our trusty acceptability question. We are given 5 scenarios, and we have to find the one that follows all the rules. So let's go ahead and look through the rules. We'll start with an easy rule. Let's start with 1 equals 5. We'll start with that rule. Whatever's in 1 has to be in 5. That's this rule over here. Let's check all the answer choices that break that one and cross them off if we find any. So A, I see that ghost is 1 and ghost is 5. So A is fine vis-a-vis that rule. B, J is 1 and J is 5. So that's fine. C, J is 1 and 5. D, L is 1 and 5. E, L is 1 and 5. So unfortunately, they all follow that rule. Let's go to the next one, though. We still have all 5 answers on the table. Let's go to the next one. 2 has to equal 7. So A, jitney is both 2 and 7. That's good. B, ghost is 2 and ghost is 7. So that's good. C, hapgood is both 2 and 7. D, H is both 2 and 7. E, J is 2 and G is 7. So that means E breaks that rule. We're going to cross E off and move on to the next rule. M and O can't be next to each other. A, they are not, so that's fine. B, they are not, so that's fine. C, they are next to each other. Macbeth and Othello are adjacent in C, so we're going to go ahead and cross that off. And D, M, and O are not adjacent, so we're left with A, B, and D. We already crossed E off, so we don't have to look at that. Next, there has to be at least one H, M. H right before M. A, I see in the middle in spots 3 and 4, we have H and then M. Good. B, I see that H and M are nowhere to be found where they're next to each other. So B breaks that rule, right? We have H in 4 and M is only in 8. So there is no H before M, at least immediately before M, anywhere in B. So that breaks that rule. D, there is an H, M in spots 2 and 3. So that's good. And then finally, there has to be a J before the first H. A, there is a J in 2 before the first H, which is in 3. So that's good. D, though, the first H is in 2, and there's no J before it, so D breaks that rule, and A is the answer. 19, which of the following must be false? That's the same thing as saying which of the following cannot be true. So we are going to go ahead and test these out, try to make them true, to look for the one that doesn't work. However, one thing we are always allowed to do when we are doing logic games, in addition to following the method, we are always allowed to use our brains and our judgment and ask ourselves, which of these answers are unlikely? So for example, A and B have to do with ghosts. Notice how G is not in any rules. So that's unlikely to be a letter that's not allowed to be somewhere. Same thing with E, loot. L is not in any rules. So G and L are very free to sort of be anywhere, seemingly. That's not to say that those answers are definitely wrong, but they're at least less likely than Hapgood not being allowed to be somewhere, because Hapgood has some restrictions. Hapgood is in 2 rules, whereas G and L are in no rules. So I would say the smart thing to do here would be to start with C. Let's go ahead and start with C, and then when we're done, we'll look at the other answer choices anyway, but at least the way that I would recommend doing this question is to start with either C or D. So C says H is on 2. Now, that causes some issues for us if H is on 2. Because of this rule, we would know that J would have to be in 1. And then if we follow these rules, if we connect the dots, whatever's in 1 has to be in 5, and whatever's in 2 has to be in 7. And we have to have an H before an M somewhere. Let's go ahead and do that at the end. The reason I elected to do it at the end is so that we will have less to worry about as far as putting O next to M. If we kind of just isolate it all the way at the end, now we can put O anywhere. And we are left with O, G, and L. And we followed all the rules, right? So O, G, and L can kind of be split up any way we'd like among those 3 spots, and C works. So it's not the answer. Let's go ahead and try D. Hapgood is on 5. Now, if H is on 5, hopefully you'll see right away that that also means that H has to be 1, which is not allowed because there has to be a J before the first H. So H is never allowed to be in 1. And therefore D does not work. And of course that means D is the answer. Now, if we look at some of these other answer choices, first of all, B says G in day 5. It happens to be that if you look at number 18, we've already done that, right? The answer to 18 was A, and ghosts was in spot 5. So we don't even have to test that out at all. Let's say you wanted to test E and A out. Let's see what that would have looked like. So we'll start with A. A says G is on 2. If we put G on 2, G has to be 7. And let's go ahead and put J in 1 and 5. We always want to put J as early as possible so that it's before the H's. Now we can put H right before M over there to satisfy that rule. And then, of course, the O is not going to be next to the M, which is good. So we can put O there, and I think we're missing L, so that would work. There's a way to make A true. And what about E? Loot is on 5. If loot's on 5, loot has to also be on 1. Again, let's try to put J as early as possible. So we'll put J in 2 and therefore also in 7. And we will put the HM over here. So we will satisfy the HM rule, and the O once again won't be next to the M. So that's good. We can put the O there, and we are missing G, and that also works. So as you can see, A and E both work. However, I think that the smart thing to do here would be to just jump to either C or D to start, and then you can figure out this question fairly quickly. Number 20, if Othello is on day 3, so as you can see, we start off by making the if true, putting O in 3, and let's look for inferences. Do the rules tell us anything else? Well, O is in one rule, and that is the rule that says that O can't be next to M, but that doesn't tell us much because M could go in any of the other spots, at least as of now. It doesn't seem like there are any restrictions on where else M can go other than spots 2 and 4. So I think there are no easy inferences here. So let's go ahead and look at the answers. We're going to move on to step 2, which is if there are no inferences, then we go ahead and test out the answer choices. So which of the following could be true? We are going to test them out by making them true to see which one works. So A, could G be on day 2? This is A. If G were on 2, then following the rules would tell us that G would have to also be 7. So we can start off like that. Now, let's look at what else we can figure out. We know that HM would have to go somewhere in those middle 3 spots, right? Because that's the only area that can satisfy the HM requirement at this point. But we will see that either way there's a problem. If we go ahead and put HM there, then whatever's in 5 has to be in 1, and we don't have a J anywhere before that H, which breaks this rule. So that wouldn't work. However, if we go ahead and put HM over there, that will actually cause the same problem because now H is in 5, so H will have to be in 1, and that will also break this rule. And therefore, this will not work no matter what, which means A is not the answer. And we can move on to B. Let's try B, right? Because A was impossible. B, could H be on 2? If H is on 2, then due to this rule, J would have to be in 1. If J's in 1, then J's in 5. If H is in 2, then H is in 7. And there has to be an HM somewhere, so that will have to be at the end. And we are missing G and L. And it seems that we followed all the rules, right? We don't have O next to M. We have an HM. We have J before all the H's. We took care of the 1, 5, 2, 7 rules. So the G and the L are interchangeable. It doesn't really matter which way you do that. It works either way, and therefore B is the correct answer since B could be true. Now, even though we're done the question, let's go ahead and look at the other answer choices to see what it would have looked like to test them out. So we'll start off with O on 3 and try C. Could loot be on 1? If loot is on 1, then that means loot is also on 5. And now we know that the HM block has to go in the last 3 spots, but similar to what happened in A, we're going to have a problem either way, because if we put HM there, then M is in 7, which means it'll have to be in 2 next to O, which breaks this rule, right? So we can't put HM in 6, 7. If we put HM in 7, 8, then H is in 7, which means H will have to be in 2, and now there's no J before that first H, so we break this rule. So either way, there's no way to make C work, and therefore that's not the answer. Now let's go ahead and look at D. Could L be on 7? If L is on 7, then that means L is on 2. And once again, we are going to have exactly the same issue that we had with A, which is HM has to either go there, which would put M in 1, and we are breaking this rule because there's no J before that first H. Or HM will have to go there, which means H is in 5, so H has to be in 1, and H is not allowed in 1 because, once again, this rule will be broken. So that's why D doesn't work either. What about E? Could M be on 7? Well, that is easier to see because if M is in 7, then M has to be in 2, and of course M and O cannot be next to each other. So that is why C, D, and E are impossible, but of course we already knew that because B was already the answer. Number 21, if H is on day 2, then which of the following could be true? So as you can see, we start off by making the if true. We put H on day 2, and before we get to the answer choices, we are going to look for inferences. So what do the rules tell us? Well, first of all, most obviously, the rules tell us that whatever is in spot 2 has to be in spot 7, which means H has to be in 2 and also in 7. Next, we are also told, if we're looking through the rules here, that there has to be a J before the first H, which means the only way to satisfy that here is by putting a j in 1. So j has to be 1. And the rules also then tell us that whatever's in 1 has to be in 5. So we're really catching a break here. We're catching a lot of inferences. So that means j has to be in 1 and in 5. Now, after that, it seems that there might be some options, right? There are no other obvious inferences here. We do have to put an m after one of those h's, but it doesn't seem that it has to be either one of them specifically. And of course, we have to not put m next to o, so m and o cannot be 3 and 4. But it seems like we have a bit of wiggle room. So let's go ahead and look at the answers. Which of the following could be true? Clearly A is impossible because J is in 1, so G cannot be 1. Clearly B is impossible. J cannot be 3 because J is in 1 and 5. C looks like it works. Loot on 8, why not? Let's put loot in 8. And that would mean that M would have to go after this H, which would mean that O would have to go over there so that it's not next to the M, which means that G, which is the only letter left, has to go there. But that works. That follows all the rules, and therefore C is the answer. Now, let's see why D and E don't work. Well, E, it's obvious. Othello on 5, no, because there's already a J in 5. And D, perhaps, is also obvious. We couldn't put an M there because then it wouldn't be directly after either of the two H's. 22, if M is on day 2, which of the following must be true? So as you can see, we start off by making the if true. We put M in 2. Let's look for inferences before we look at the answers. We always want to see if there's anything else we can figure out. So of course, whatever's in 2 has to be in 7, which means that M has to be in 7. And we have another couple of rules with M. First of all, there has to be an H immediately before an M somewhere, but that couldn't be this first M because H never goes in spot 1 because there has to be a J before the first H, and that would break that rule. Therefore, H will have to go here in spot 6. Now, what's our other M-related rule? We are not allowed to have O next to M, which very much limits where O can go because it can't go there, right? Because we have our M's kind of all over the place right now. So we can't have an O there or there or there. That only leaves 2 spots seemingly, except wait a second, it only leaves 1 spot because if O went in 5, then O would have to be in 1 because those 2 spots have to be the same. So O can't go in 5 either, which means our next somewhat tricky inference here is that O, by process of elimination, has to go in spot 4. And of course, that's the answer to the question. If we glance through the answers, it seems that we found the answer. E, Othello must be on day 4. We just proved. We just inferred that. And therefore, that is the answer to this question. Now, I will grant that that was somewhat of a tricky inference. We sort of had to use process of elimination. We had to notice that O was a little bit sensitive because those M's were sort of spreading their wings all over the setup, right? It seemed that those M's were sort of everywhere. So that was what made us think, wait a second, O is so limited in where it can go. Let's see if we can narrow that down. But that being said, yes, that was hard to see. So let's pretend we didn't see that inference. And let's pretend we had to actually test out the answer choices here. I think these first couple of inferences were pretty easy. But let's pretend we didn't see that tricky inference that got us to the answer. Let's try to test them out. So A, does A have to be true? Does G have to be in 6? No, clearly that's actually impossible because H is in 6. So A we can skip. B, does H have to be in 3? No, clearly that's impossible because H has to be in 6, right? H can't be in 6 and also in 3. So A and B are impossible. Not only do they not have to be true, they are impossible. So we can go straight to C. Does J have to be in 1? Now, we're trying to make this false because we're trying to disprove that it must be true. So where else should we put J? Well, we always like to put J as early as possible so that we don't have to worry about this rule. So if it's not in 1, let's put it in 3. And, of course, this is testing out C. Let's just make note of that. And let's see, what do we have left to take care of? We have to not put O next to M. Let's put the O over there where it's far away from the M's. And we are left with G and L, so it doesn't really matter which one goes where. We can put the L's in 1 and 5 and the G in 8, or we could have flipped that. It didn't matter. And we followed all the rules. So we just showed that C could be false. Jitney was not in 1. And look at that. We made D false also. We didn't put loot in 8, which proves that that's not the answer either. Now, we could have switched that around, right? As luck had it, we put G in 8 instead of L. But even had we done it the other way around, we could have easily seen that that was flippable, and we could have just made that small change to C to test out D as well. At any rate, hopefully now you can understand why A, B, C, and D all can be false, as we've just shown, which means they are not things that must be true. E is the correct answer. And once again, that was an inference that you could have seen from the beginning. If you were looking carefully, you could have seen that O had to be in spot 4. Number 23, our final question on this game. If L is in 7 and O is on 8, which of the following must be true? So we start off by making the if true. We put L in 7 and O in 8. And before we do anything, we want to look for inferences. So the rules tell us that whatever's in 7 has to be in 2. That's pretty easy. So since L is in 7, L has to be in 2 as well. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like there are any other inferences here because L is not in any rules, so nothing's really triggered by L, and O is just in that one rule that says M can't be next to it, which we couldn't break that rule even if we tried here, right? So that rule isn't really telling us anything because they've taken care of it for us by isolating O at the very end. So therefore, we have to go to step 2, which is testing out the answer choices. And because this is a must-be-true question, we test them out by trying to disprove them, trying to make them false. So let's start with A. A says G is on day 6. Now, a lot of people here have trouble because they say, how do I make this false? I know how to make it true, right? I just put G in 6. But where do I start if I'm making it false? What do I do? Do I just put G somewhere else? What do I do here? The answer is, and this is kind of tricky, you sort of have to use your instinct here, because if we want to try to make A false, G is not going to be the problem because G is not in any rules, right? G seemingly can go anywhere, right? So rather than worrying about where G goes, let's worry about what goes in spot 6, right? If it's not G, then who else could it possibly be, right? So if G is not in 6, well, we know it's not L or O because they are already accounted for. That leaves H, J, or M. And as you can see, at least one or two of those are impossible. H, J, M. It could not be H because then you won't have an HM anywhere, right? Whatever goes in 6 is not doubled. So that's our only H, and therefore that would not follow that rule. So it can't be H. That leaves M and J. J, you can probably see, doesn't work either because that's too late in the game for J to be showing up. We have to have a J before our first H. So if J is only in spot 6, remember, whatever's in 6 is just a single. So that means that's our only J. That won't work because we can't have any H's anywhere. So that only leaves M. The only way to make A false is to put M in spot 6. And remember, that made sense to look at spot 6 rather than looking at G because not putting G in 6, if you worry about where to put G, G can sort of go anywhere. G is such a flexible letter, right? So that's why it made a little more sense to think about, well, what else could go in spot 6, seeing as there were only 2 or 3 letters left, and those letters carry a lot of restrictions with them. So anyway, the only way to make A false is to try to put M in 6. Now, here's the thing. If M is in 6, then we know that because of this rule, H will have to go in 5, right? Because that's our only M, so that's our only chance at following that rule. But wait a second, H can't go in 5 because then H will go in 1, and that breaks this rule, which means, we found the answer. This doesn't work. We can't make A false, right? We just proved methodically that there's no way to make A false, which means A is the answer. That's a little bit of a tricky one to test out, but hopefully you were able to follow the intuition of how we knew how to approach it this way. Now, let's look at the other answer choices. Let's prove that the other answer choices are wrong. Let's see what it would have looked like to test B out. H is on day 3. Well, let's put H somewhere other than day 3, right? So H can never go in 5 because then it would end up being in 1 also, as we've pointed out several times. That doesn't work. And H can't go in 6 because then it won't be right before M. But what if we put H in 4? And then M would be in 5, which means M is in 1, right? M is not touching O, so that's fine. And we are left with G and J. Now the J has to go before the first H, so J will go there. And G will end up going over there. And look at that. We just made B false. H didn't have to be on 3. We also made C false. As luck would have it, J clearly didn't have to be on day 1. And as luck would have it, we also made D false. M did not have to be in 4. As you can see, H was in 4. So the only thing left to test is E, because E, it turns out we made true. So we haven't disproven E yet. So let's try to move things around. Instead of putting M on 5, let's make that false. Let's move these back a little and put the HM on 3 and 4. And then the J will have to be in 1, right? This L is still there, and so is that L and that O. So the J will have to go before that H, right? The H is in 3, so the J will have to go in 1, which means the J is in 5 also, right? And once again, G will end up in 6. It's the only letter left. Of course, we knew that because we knew that G has to be in day 6 in this question, but even if we didn't know that, we'd still end up at this scenario if we were testing out E, and therefore E could be false. As you can see, we didn't put M in 5, we put J in 5, and that worked. And therefore, we just proved E wrong. So ideally, the way you do this question is just from testing out A and seeing that you can't make it false, and then you're done. But if for whatever reason you wanted to test out the other answer choices, this is what that would have looked like. So hopefully this makes sense, and that marks the end of this logic game. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.